In the shifting sands of ancient Syria, more than 3,000 years ago, the destiny of empires was decided not by peace, but by blood. The year was 1274 BCE. Two of the greatest powers the ancient world had ever known stood at the edge of war. To the south, the mighty Egyptian Empire, ruled by Pharaoh Ramesses II, the self-proclaimed son of the gods, the builder of monuments, and the man who sought to carve his name into eternity. To the north, the Hittite Empire, forged in the mountains of Anatolia a people of iron and chariots, led by the ambitious king Muwatalli II. Between them lay Kadesh, a fortified city at the crossroads of the ancient world, a prize that controlled the trade routes of Syria, and with it, the balance of power across the Near East. Both kings claimed it. Both sent armies that would darken the desert with dust. As the sun rose over the Orontes River, the sands trembled under thousands of hooves. Egyptian chariots, gleaming with bronze, surged forward under the banners of the falcon god Horus. Beyond the horizon, hidden behind the hills, the Hittites waited silent, patient, and ready to strike. What followed was the largest chariot battle in human history, a clash of over 5,000 war chariots where divine ambition met human deception. And though both Pharaoh and king would claim victory, what truly emerged from the chaos was something far greater: the world's first recorded peace treaty, etched not on papyrus, but into stone and memory. Long before the sands of Kadesh were stained with blood, the world of the 13th century before Christ was a vast chessboard of rising empires, each seeking to carve its place into the stone of eternity. In the south, the Egyptian Empire stood at its golden height. Under Pharaoh Ramesses II, Egypt stretched from the cataracts of Nubia to the edge of the Levant, a realm of temples, gold, and divine kingship. Ramesses was not merely a ruler. He was a living god. Crowned at the age of 24, his reign would last over 6 decades, one of the longest in human history. His people called him Uzurmatra Setepenre, the justice of Ra, chosen of Ra. He built cities where deserts once lay, monuments that pierced the horizon, and temples carved into living rock. Every wall, every obelisk, bore his image, the warrior Pharaoh, smiting his enemies under the gaze of the gods. But beneath the splendor of his monuments lay a ruler, consumed by ambition. He sought not just to defend Egypt's empire, but to restore the glory once held by his ancestors, the conquerors of the 18th dynasty. Yet, to the north, a new power had risen, one that Egypt could no longer ignore. Across the rugged mountains of Anatolia, in the heartland of modern-day Turkey, the Hittite Empire had forged a kingdom as fierce as it was mysterious. From their capital at Hattusa, the Hittite commanded legions of soldiers armed with weapons few others possessed iron. They were among the first people to master the black metal, giving them tools and blades far stronger than the bronze of their rivals. But iron was not their only weapon. The Hittites were masters of diplomacy and espionage, weaving alliances and rivalries that stretched from the Aegean to Mesopotamia. Their kings ruled through intricate treaties, their scribes inscribing laws and correspondence on clay tablets that still survive today, silent witnesses to a world that once burned with ambition. At the center of their growing power stood King Muwatalli II, a ruler both pragmatic and cunning. He had moved his capital closer to the south, to the city of Tarhuntassa, positioning his armies nearer the frontiers of Syria, nearer to Egypt. For Muwatalli knew that control of the Levant meant control of trade, tribute, and the very arteries of the ancient world. Between these two empires, Egypt and Hatti, lay a contested land, Canaan and Syria. Cities here shifted allegiance like the desert wind, each one pledging loyalty to whichever king's army stood nearest. And at the very heart of it all stood Kadesh, a fortress city on the banks of the Orontes River. To both powers, Kadesh was more than a city. It was a symbol, the key to empire. Whoever held Kadesh controlled the northern gateway to Egypt, the southern doorway to Hatti, and the trade routes that carried cedar from Lebanon, copper from Cyprus, and gold from Africa. For Ramses II, reclaiming Kadesh meant securing Egypt's prestige and proving himself the equal, if not the superior, of his ancestors, like Thutmose III, who had once conquered the same lands a century before. For Muwatalli, defending Kadesh meant halting Egypt's advance, preserving the Hittite sphere of influence, and demonstrating to all kingdoms from Ugarit to Babylon that the Hittites were still the supreme power of the north. The two empires had danced around each other for decades, through skirmishes, border disputes, and uneasy truces. But now, the time for diplomacy was over. Ramses gathered his army's 4 divisions named after the gods Amun, Ra, Ptah, and Set, and began the march northward. Behind him, priests chanted hymns to the gods, proclaiming that the pharaoh was invincible, his cause divine. To his people, this was a holy war, the restoration of Egypt's destiny. To the Hittites, it was a test of survival, and as both empires moved toward Kadesh, neither truly understood the other's strength or how fragile their own would soon become. The road to Kadesh was long, and every step carried the weight of empire. In the spring of 1274 BCE, Pharaoh Ramesses II set out from his royal city of Pharaoh Ramesses, the jewel of the Nile Delta, a city he had built to honor his own name. From its gates marched the full strength of Egypt's northern army, banners glinting in the desert sun. Ramses did not travel alone. He led what Egyptian inscriptions proudly called the greatest army on earth, with 20,000 soldiers divided into 4 great divisions, each named after one of Egypt's gods: Amun, Ra, Ptah, and Set. The division of Amun, commanded personally by the pharaoh, was the pride of Egypt's military elite royal guards, veteran charioteers, and priests who carried sacred standards into battle. Behind them followed Ra, the blazing sun, Ptah, the builder's god from Memphis, and Set, the storm-bringer fierce men drawn from Egypt's southern frontier. Together they formed a living procession of divine power, a moving temple of war. Each division marched separately, days apart, spread across the great northern road that led through Canaan and into the lands of modern Syria. Chariots rolled across the sands, their wheels reinforced with bronze. The horses, bred in Egyptian stables, trained for speed and terror. Behind them came the supply caravans, wagons carrying grain, water, and weapons, guarded by archers and scouts. Priests sang hymns to the gods, while scribes recorded the march, ensuring that every act of their divine king would be remembered. Yet far beyond the pharaoh's gaze, another army was already in motion. Across the mountains of Anatolia, King Muwatalli II had gathered his own hosts, a coalition drawn from every corner of the Hittite Empire. From the vassal kingdoms of Aleppo, Carchemish, and Ugarit came contingents of warriors and chariots. From the lands of Dardanians, Mysians, and Lucca, seafaring allies from the Aegean coast, came mercenaries hungry for plunder. Together, the Hittite alliance numbered some 40,000 men and over 3,500 chariots. The largest force the Hittites had ever assembled. Their chariots were heavier than Egypt's, built for shock and endurance, carrying 3 men each, a driver, a lancer, and a shield-bearer. While Ramses' chariots relied on speed and maneuver, the Hittites' strength lay in weight and surprise. Muwatalli knew the Egyptians would come north. He knew Ramses's pride would compel him to retake Kadesh, a city that had once been Egypt's but had fallen under Hittite control. So he planned an ambush. According to the Hittite records, Muwatalli stationed his army behind Kadesh, hidden beyond the Orontes River, while sending a small band of false deserters to mislead the pharaoh. These men, dressed as Bedouins, pretended to defect to the Egyptian side, claiming that the Hittite army had fled north in fear. The ruse worked. Ramesses, believing victory was near, pushed forward recklessly with only his Amun division, racing ahead of his slower division still days behind. It was a decision that would nearly destroy him. Egyptian temple inscriptions carved by Ramses's own scribes tell of divine inspiration and flawless leadership. In the poem of Pentor, the pharaoh is described as the valiant warrior who stood alone, surrounded by the foes of Hatti, yet protected by the hand of Amun. But the Hittite tablets from Hattusa tell a different story. They speak of chaos of Egyptian divisions scattered and surprised, of chariots caught unprepared, and of the pharaoh forced to rally his troops from the brink of annihilation. Between these two accounts lies the truth, a battlefield of confusion, dust, and fear. As Ramses approached Kadesh, he set up camp on the west bank of the Orontes River, unaware that tens of thousands of Hittite soldiers were waiting just beyond the hills. Scouts returned with conflicting reports, and the false prisoners assured him that Muwatalli was still far away. Confident in his triumph, Ramses ordered his men to rest, his camp still open, his rear divisions far behind. But even as the pharaoh prayed to Amun for victory, the Hittite king was already crossing the river with his elite chariot corps. The two greatest armies of the Bronze Age were now separated by a few miles of sand and silence, neither truly aware of the other's full might. The air was heavy with heat, the horizon shimmering. To the Egyptians, this was destiny, the reclaiming of an empire lost. To the Hittites, it was survival, a defense of their dominion. However, the march that began in triumph was about to descend into chaos. Soon, the thunder of hooves would echo across the plain of Kadesh, and in that moment, the pharaoh who believed himself a god would discover how fragile even divine power could be. The sun rose high over the plains of Kadesh, its light striking the Orontes River like molten bronze. To the Egyptian soldiers in Pharaoh's camp, it was a day of expected triumph. The banners of Amun fluttered in the wind, and Ramses II, the living god of Egypt, prepared his men for a swift victory. But beyond the horizon, hidden by the ridges north of Kadesh, the Hittite army waited silent, disciplined, and ready to strike. King Muwatalli II, commander of Hatti, had watched the Egyptian advance with cold patience. Behind the city's walls, he had assembled the greatest chariot corps of the Bronze Age, over 3,000 heavy chariots, manned by seasoned warriors from his vassal states, Carchemish, Aleppo, Ugarit, and the Lucca lands of the Aegean coast. Their chariots were broad and solid, each drawn by a pair of powerful horses, carrying 3 men, a driver, a lancer, and a shield-bearer. Their mission was simple: destroy the isolated Egyptian divisions before the rest could arrive. Late in the morning, as the Egyptian advance guard of the Rod division crossed the Orontes and approached Kadesh, the trap was sprung. Out of the dust and heat, the ground began to tremble. The Hittite chariots burst from concealment, a wall of bronze and leather thundering across the plain. The sky filled with the roar of hooves and the snapping of reins. The Egyptian scouts, unprepared, barely had time to shout a warning. The Ra division, stretched thin along the road, was caught completely off guard. In moments, the front ranks crumbled. Hittite chariots crashed through the Egyptian line, splintering formations, overturning wagons, cutting down archers and runners alike. Horses screamed as the desert filled with chaos, dust, shouting, and blood. The poem of Pentor describes the moment with divine exaggeration, yet behind its poetry lies a brutal truth. No officer was with me, no charioteer, no soldier. My warriors and chariot men had fled before the foes of Hatti. Not one stood firm. Ramesses, who had camped nearby with the Amun division, suddenly found himself alone, surrounded by the debris of his shattered army. Panic spread through the camp as Hittite chariots burst through the perimeter, smashing tents and supply wagons. The pharaoh's scribes and priests fled. Horses broke their tethers. The chariots of Hatti rolled like thunder through the heart of the Egyptian encampment. For a moment, it seemed that Egypt's greatest king would fall not in glory but in chaos. Yet, in the heart of disaster, Ramesses acted. The inscriptions carved into his temples would later call it divine intervention, that in his darkest hour, the god Amun filled his heart with courage. The pharaoh leapt into his chariot, his golden armor gleaming beneath the Syrian sun. He called to his bodyguard, his remaining retainers, and the survivors of the Amun division. And then he charged not away from battle, but directly into the storm. According to the poem of Pentor, Ramesses cried out, "I am like Montu, lord of Thebes. None can stand before me. I charge alone, and I drive back millions." Whether divine courage or sheer desperation, the charge stunned the Hittites. Ramesses' chariot crashed into the disordered enemy ranks. Egyptian archers on the chariots loosed arrows with deadly precision, felling horses and crewmen. For a time, the battlefield became a whirl of motion Egyptian light chariots, darting between the heavier Hittite machines, turning speed into survival. Ramesses' personal valor became the axis on which the entire battle turned. His surviving soldiers, inspired by the sight of their pharaoh fighting at the front, rallied. The Hittite chariots, disorganized from their initial success, began to lose formation amid the chaos of tents and bodies. Then, as the battle hung in balance, the Nearin, a reserve Egyptian force, likely mercenaries and reinforcements from Amurru, arrived from the south. Their appearance on the horizon shifted the tide. The Hittite charioteers, cut off from their infantry and now facing renewed Egyptian counterattacks, began to fall back toward the river. Some were overturned in the water, others were cut down, as the Egyptians regained ground. The dust cloud that rose above Kadesh that day could be seen for miles, a swirling chaos of bronze, blood, and smoke. By sunset, the field was strewn with wrecked chariots, broken weapons, and the dead of both nations. Ramesses had survived the ambush, but his victory was uncertain. The bulletin of Ramesses II, inscribed on temple walls from Abu Simbel to Karnak, declared the pharaoh triumphant, claiming that the Hittites fled in terror before his might. The Hittite tablets from Hattusa, however, tell a different story, that Muwatalli still held Kadesh and that Ramesses was forced to retreat. Between them lies the reality of ancient war, a stalemate written in stone, where both kings claimed glory and neither gained ground. The Egyptian army withdrew south to safety. The Hittites reoccupied Kadesh, battered but unbroken. And though tens of thousands had fought, nothing had truly changed except the memory of how close both empires came to ruin. Yet even in stalemate, the legend of Kadesh would live on. For Ramesses, it became a monument to endurance and divine favor. For the Hittites, a warning carved into clay. And for history, it stood as the dawn of a new age, where kings began to realize that conquest had limits, and that peace might sometimes serve empire better than war. As the sun dipped beyond the Syrian hills, the battlefield of Kadesh fell silent. The thunder of hooves had faded. The cries of charioteers and the clash of bronze were replaced by the stillness of dusk, a silence heavy with exhaustion and loss. Both armies, shattered and bloodied, withdrew to count the cost. For Pharaoh Ramesses II, survival itself became the seed of legend. Though his divisions had been ambushed and his army nearly destroyed, he returned to his camp alive, and that, in Egypt's eyes, was proof of divine favor. In the following months, stonemasons across Egypt chiseled the story that their pharaoh commanded. From Abu Simbel to Thebes, from Luxor to Karnak, the walls came alive with scenes of Ramses driving his chariot alone into the heart of the Hittite army, scattering thousands before him. These inscriptions, known as the Poem of Pentar and the Bulletin of Ramses II, proclaimed that the god Amun himself had granted Ramses strength when all others had fled. They showed the pharaoh as a solitary hero, stronger than 100,000 men. To his subjects, Ramses was no longer just a king. He was a living god who had faced the might of Hatti and emerged unbroken. But far to the north, in the capital of Hattusa, another story was being written on clay rather than stone. The Hittite royal scribes, serving King Muwatalli II, recorded their own account of Kadesh. In their version, it was the Hittite army that triumphed. They claimed Ramses had been driven back in disarray, his retreat covered by reinforcements too late to change the outcome. The city of Kadesh, they declared, remained firmly in Hittite hands. 2 kings, 2 empires, 2 truths carved into history, each unyielding, each certain. However, beneath the pride and propaganda, both rulers knew the reality. The Battle of Kadesh had left neither victor nor vanquished. It had drained the strength of both empires, and the frontier between them still burned with tension. For years after the battle, small border conflicts continued. Cities and tribes shifted allegiance between Egypt and Hatti, testing the patience and power of both. But time and age began to change the ambitions of kings. Muwatalli II died not long after Kadesh, succeeded by his brother Hattusili III, a ruler more statesman than warrior. In Egypt, Ramses II grew older, his empire vast but restless. Both men faced new enemies, rebellions at home, famine, and the slow erosion of the Bronze Age world, as thus, after nearly 2 decades of uneasy peace, diplomacy triumphed where chariots had failed. Around 1259 BCE, envoys from Egypt arrived in Hattusa bearing gifts and messages of reconciliation. The result would become one of humanity's greatest milestones, the world's first recorded peace treaty. The Treaty of Kadesh, as modern scholars call it, survives in 2 forms: the Egyptian version, carved into the walls of the Temple of Karnak, and the Hittite version, preserved on clay tablets found in the archives of Hattusa. The wording differs slightly between them, but their message is the same: a formal, mutual declaration of peace, alliance, and eternal friendship between 2 empires that had once sought to destroy each other. The treaty begins with solemn oaths invoking the gods of both nations, Ra and Amun of Egypt, Teshub and Ishtar of Hatti, witnesses to an agreement that neither side would ever again take up arms against the other. It proclaims that there shall be no hostility between them forever. If another enemy attack the land of Ramses, the king of Hatti shall come to his aid. And if another enemy attack the land of Hatti, the king of Egypt shall come to his aid. It was more than a truce. It was an early vision of collective security, a promise of mutual defense and cooperation written 1,000 years before Rome or Greece ever dreamed of diplomacy. To seal the bond, Ramses II married a Hittite princess, strengthening the alliance not with swords, but with kinship. The treaty held. For the remainder of Ramses's reign, nearly 40 years more, there was no war between Egypt and Hatti. The two empires coexisted in peace, trading, exchanging envoys, and maintaining stability across the Near East. Today, the words of that ancient pact still survive. The original Hittite clay tablets are kept in the Istanbul Archaeological Museum, while a replica of the treaty inscribed in both cuneiform and hieroglyphs stands at the United Nations headquarters in New York, a symbol of humankind's earliest known effort to make peace through law rather than violence. The Treaty of Kadesh became a precedent, a model of realpolitik, diplomacy grounded not in love or idealism, but in mutual need. Both Egypt and Hatti understood that endless war served neither. Peace, though born of exhaustion, ensured survival. In the centuries that followed, both empires would fade. The Hittites would vanish under the weight of the late Bronze Age collapse. Egypt would endure, but never again as a global empire. Yet their legacy, written in stone and clay, endured across millennia. In the centuries since the dust of Kadesh settled, the echoes of that day have never truly faded. Across the temples of Egypt, Ramses II immortalized his victory in a language more enduring than words: stone. On the walls of Abu Simbel, he charged forward forever, bow drawn, chariot wheels spinning in divine fury. The same scenes were carved at Karnak, Luxor, and the Ramesseum, each one proclaiming that the pharaoh had triumphed by the grace of the god Amun. The poem of Pentar and the bulletin of Ramses II repeat the story in rhythmic verse: how Ramses stood alone against thousands, how he was betrayed by cowardly soldiers, how he fought like Baal in his hour. To Egypt, this was not just history, it was theology. The pharaoh had turned survival into sacred myth, and through these carvings, Ramses achieved what every ruler craved: immortality. Even as empires rose and fell, his image endured the warrior king frozen in triumph. The story of Kadesh became part of Egypt's national identity, a reminder that the pharaoh's power came not only from the sword, but from the narrative he commanded. Yet beyond the Nile, the world changed. The Hittite Empire, Egypt's great rival, soon vanished into the shadows of history. Archaeological evidence from Hattusa shows that within a century of the treaty, the mighty cities of Hatti fell silent. Clay tablets stopped being written, palaces were burned, fortresses abandoned. Whatever the cause, the Hittite Empire collapsed around 1200 BCE, leaving behind only broken walls and the clay tablets that told of their kings and treaties. Ramses' Egypt, though it endured longer, would also begin to wane. By the time of Ramses' death, after a reign of more than 66 years, the cost of his building projects, wars, and divine image had strained the empire's wealth. Successors would struggle to hold what he once claimed, and the world would slowly pass into a new age, one ruled not by pharaohs and chariots, but by iron and empires of a different kind. For the first time in over 3,000 years, the voices of both sides could be heard again. And when the Egyptian and Hittite versions were compared, something remarkable emerged, not contradiction, but complement. Each side told its own truth, yet together they revealed something larger, a shared recognition that neither could destroy the other, and that peace was the only lasting victory. The Battle of Kadesh became more than an ancient war. It became a mirror reflecting the eternal struggle between ambition and wisdom, between the desire for glory and the necessity of peace. It showed that empires, no matter how mighty, stand only as long as they can balance pride with pragmatism. Ramses II turned defeat into legend. The Hittites turned survival into strategy. Both found in each other the limits of power. However, Empires rise not only through conquest, but through the stories they choose to tell. It is pertinent to say that, in a world shaped by ambition and pride, peace was forged not by conquest, but by compromise. Don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe.